first realized the gravity of my situation when I was floating some 2,000 kilometers from the shimmering blue beacon of Earth, close enough to see the swirling continents but far too distant to hope for rescue. My oxygen levels blinked dangerously low, and a needle-thin layer of polycarbonate was all that separated my flesh from the lethal vacuum of space. Years ago, my training as an astronaut taught me to expect the unexpected, but who could have possibly prepared me for the horrors of time travel, undead remnants of humanity, and a single miscalculation that left me stranded in the cold black? My name is Dr. Dennis Stanton, and I am about to die. Here is my story. I was born in 2075 on the outskirts of Houston, Texas. From my earliest memories, I was obsessed with the stars and everything that lay beyond our tiny planet. It was that curiosity that propelled me through a rigorous academic path, a doctorate in theoretical physics, followed by specialized training at NASA. By the time I turned 35, I was selected to join a team of scientists stationed on the Lunar Re-Exploration Base, LREB. My primary role was to oversee experiments on quantum entanglement and gravitational lensing, but I was also secretly involved in the development of a device we codenamed the Hopper. The Hopper was never meant to be a time machine, at least not initially. It was designed for short-distance quantum leaps, a propulsion mechanism that would allow astronauts to hop from one orbital path to another without using traditional fuels. We discovered by accident that these quantum leaps could be recalibrated to shift an object in time. I led the team in refining this mechanism, dreaming of possibilities, traveling a few hours into the future to study cosmic events, or maybe going backward a day to correct a catastrophic error. But we had no illusions about the dangers. We had theories about paradoxes, about the universe's innate resistance to rewriting history, about the physical toll on the human body if the leaps became too large. And then came the mission that changed everything. My superiors insisted I test the Hopper for real. The year was 2110, and Earth's governments were more fractured than they had ever been. Rumors of advanced nuclear arms proliferating across global powers spread terror among the population, and the environment teetered on irreversible collapse. Even in that precarious time, the space program persisted, partly out of desperation for an escape route if Earth became uninhabitable. I was tasked with demonstrating that the Hopper could send me to the year 2130, a mere 20-year forward jump, gather data on Earth's condition, and return safely. The morning of my departure, I woke to find myself strangely calm. The training facilities on the moon were silent, haunted by a perpetual hush that seemed to be the very echo of the lunar desert. I floated through the corridors in my zero-G suit, mentally checking and rechecking every step of the Hopper's operation. My colleagues, numbering fewer than a dozen, watched me with a mixture of awe and dread. Our lab was a sterile, pressurized dome with transparent windows showing the surface of the moon. In the center stood a sleek platform where the Hopper's power crystals hummed with barely contained energy. Carefully, I stepped onto the platform in my custom EVA suit, checking all the readings. The plan was simple. Power up the Hopper, set the coordinates to Earth's orbit in 2013, materialize above Earth in a low orbital path, quickly measure the planet's status, and hop back. The world was watching me, or at least NASA was streaming my every move back to Earth. I gave one last thumbs up and initiated the Hopper. A sudden lurch in my gut, an explosion of light, and then blackness. I had never experienced such a sensation. It was as though every atom in my body disassembled and reassembled 1,000,000 times in a second. When I opened my eyes, I was in orbit over Earth, precisely as planned. The planet spun below me, a swirling marble of green and brown continents against deep blue oceans. At first glance, it looked like Earth was still healthy, with no obvious signs of nuclear winter or catastrophic meltdown. But the orbit was eerily silent. No satellites, no chatter on my communications channels. I attempted to link to the old NASA frequency, expecting static or signals, but there was nothing. After hours of circling the planet, I chose my landing site, near what once was the Johnson Space Center in Houston. I initiated the entry sequence and found that the Earth's atmosphere had thickened slightly with dust and debris, making the descent rough, but my landing module managed. Then the real horror began. Touching down near the ruins of Houston, I saw that the city lay in charred rubble. Skeletons of skyscrapers jutted out of the earth, windows shattered, roads cracked and buried under layers of ash. I stepped out carefully, my EVA suit's sensors detecting dangerously high levels of radiation in some patches. The temperature was scorching, yet my suit's internal systems kept me cool. What unsettled me most was not the devastation, but the sense of quiet. No animals, no insects, no human voices. I walked among the ruins, searching for any sign of life. Something scuttled behind a rusted car frame, but by the time I got close, it was gone. When the sun set, I saw small fires flickering in the distance, possibly from chemical leaks, or maybe from pockets of methane. The darkness closed in faster than I had anticipated, and my lights revealed contorted silhouettes. Was it my imagination? Number, it was real. A figure stumbled out from behind a partially collapsed wall, limping. Its eyes reflected a dull hunger in the beam of my flashlight. The figure's skin hung in strips from its bones, and its hair was matted with congealed blood. It opened its mouth in a low moan, revealing shattered teeth and blackened gums. It was once human, but now it was something else, a thing born of nuclear devastation. More figures appeared behind it, each grotesque in its own way. Some had twisted limbs, others dragged bodies fused with melted clothing. They shuffled in my direction, drawn by movement, by the promise of living flesh. I felt adrenaline spike through me. I had read about nuclear fallout, about how the radiation could cause horrific mutations. But what stood before me seemed worse than any medical journal's grim prognosis. These were not just mutated humans. They appeared rabid, zombie-like. As they closed in, I backed away, fumbling with the hopper's controls on my wrist, but it needed time to recharge. My presence, my life force, seemed to spur them into a frenzy. Suddenly, one lurched forward with shocking speed, clawing at my suit. Its fingers dragged across my visor, leaving bloody smears. Panicking, I delivered a desperate kick to its torso, sending it staggering. Another swung at me with a swollen, tumor-ridden arm. I ducked. They groaned, moaned, hissed. That cacophony still haunts me. It was the sound of insatiable hunger, of a living plague. Stumbling backward, I fired a small thruster on my suit to give me a momentary boost. I retreated through the ruins, searching desperately for a building, or any structure that could offer temporary shelter. Eventually, I found the battered shell of what might have been a bunkered research facility. Its reinforced steel doors were half blown off, but the corridor beyond seemed relatively intact. I rushed inside, sealed the door as best I could from the inside, and waited, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echo inside the visor. The moans outside grew louder. Dozens more had gathered. I had to think quickly. Inside the dim corridor, my suit's lights illuminated scrawled messages on the walls. They broke through, no survivors, and God forgive us. The stench of decay made me grateful for the sealed environment of my EVA suit. The moaning grew louder. The door behind me gave a protesting shriek as skeletal hands pried it open. I had only one choice: power the hopper, for another jump. The device needed a stable vantage point to be recalibrated, and apparently it was going to have to be here. Time was slipping away. My vital sensors showed spikes in my stress levels, dangerously elevated heart rate, but I forced myself to focus on the power sequence. It wasn't just a matter of pressing a button. I had to ensure that I input the correct year and orbital trajectory to return to my original time. The calculations raced through my brain. I typed them into the suit's console with trembling fingers, a swirl of numbers and quantum field approximations. A hideous face pressed against the small window in the steel door, spittle and blood smearing the glass. The handle rattled, and the shrieks multiplied. My vantage on the corridor showed half a dozen of these creatures. They wore the shredded remnants of civilian clothing, their skin blistered from radiation and disease, their eyes blackened pits of madness. The door began to buckle under the weight of many bodies. I initiated the hopper. The quantum field crackled. The small power crystal in my chest harness glowed bright. The door burst open, and an entire wave of undead poured in, reaching for me with contorted fingers. I heard the device's rising whir, felt the air crackle, and a splitting headache tore through me as space and time bent. With a flash, I vanished. Reappearing in the vacuum of space, I gasped and nearly choked on my own breath. My suit's environmental systems took a second to normalize. My mind reeled from the leap. Something was wrong. I was supposed to be near the moon's orbit, or perhaps inside the LRB lab, but instead I found myself adrift, the Earth looming alarmingly close in my field of view. The blue planet spun peacefully. I recognized the outlines of the continents, the swirling patterns of the clouds. It looked so normal, so full of life. Yet there were no transmissions pinging on my communications array, no sign of satellites, no sign of the LREB. My attempt at returning to my original timeline had gone awry. Still, I tried to keep calm. The hopper had carried me far enough that I was at least back to a version of Earth that appeared less ravaged. My best guess was that I had arrived in approximately the correct year, give or take a decade, but my spatial coordinates were off. If I could just recalibrate the hopper again, I might fix it, but the power crystal was nearly depleted. I had used most of its charge, making that emergency jump away from the abominations on Earth's surface. I floated, weightless, scanning for anything. An orbiting station, a manned vessel, nothing. My console read a dangerously low battery in the hopper. I tried to reroute auxiliary power from my suit, but the system beeped in warning. Despite the sinking feeling in my gut, I began the calculations for one final jump. Earth's orbit around the sun is not a static point in space. It's a constant dance across millions of kilometers. Time travel complicates this further because you must account for Earth's position not only in orbit, but in the galactic plane. One miscalculation, and you end up in the void. My mind raced through the complex mathematics, and I typed them in. I pressed the activation sequence. The crystal flickered, the field hummed, and then darkness, pain, a swirling sensation as the universe blurred around me. My eyes squeezed shut, and I forced them open just as the hopper discharged its final energy. The first thing I saw was the Earth, gloriously spherical, luminous with sunlight. Relief flooded me, but only for a second. I was still drifting in space, no station or spacecraft in sight. Checking my coordinates, I realized I was physically near Earth in the right time, but the planet was just out of reach. My suit's small propulsion jets had only a finite amount of thrust, not nearly enough to break orbit and enter the atmosphere, and the planet's gravity well was too far away to capture me. I was trapped in a stable but isolated trajectory, an accidental orbit that kept me in perpetual limbo. If I had arrived just a little closer, Earth's gravity would pull me in, but I was off by the slimmest margin, maybe a few 100 kilometers too high to be reeled in. I tried every method I knew to nudge my suit's path, to gain that fraction of delta V needed. The jet spluttered. The suit beeped in protest. No progress. The Earth sat there like a painting, so near yet impossibly distant, unreachable. The hopper was drained. The power crystal was a useless chunk of transparent mineral. My oxygen levels read at 20% and dropping. My mind drifted, from frantic to resigned. I radioed on every known frequency, screaming into the void, "This is Dr. Dennis Stanton, requesting immediate assistance. Coordinates." And I rattled them off over and over. Static. No reply. I wondered if NASA, or some future iteration of it, still existed. Perhaps they'd appear any moment in a rescue craft. But with every minute that passed, hope faded. I gazed at Earth, identifying the faint outlines of the continents in the daylight side, the glow of city lights in the darkness. It was heartbreakingly beautiful, a silent testament to life itself. Did they even know I was up here? Did they care? I started to cry, tears rolling inside my visor. My oxygen alarm beeped again. 15%. In that clarity of impending doom, memories flooded my thoughts. My father teaching me to look at the stars with a backyard telescope. My mother's voice encouraging me to pursue knowledge. The smell of the lunar lab. The hum of the hopper's energy crystals. That first terrifying glimpse of the zombie-like creatures in the future. I thought of how close I had been to saving that doomed Earth, or at least bringing news back in time that might prevent the cataclysm. Had I succeeded in returning that knowledge to the right timeline, it could have changed everything. But now, there would be no data. There would be no warnings. I would die alone, drifting. I checked my suit again. 9% oxygen. Barely enough for a few minutes. The comms were still silent. Panic threatened to rise, but I repressed it. At the academy, they trained us to remain calm in the face of death, to accept the possible outcomes of our missions. It was easy to stay calm in training simulations. In the face of reality, this slow suffocation in the absolute emptiness of space, calm is a difficult state to achieve. Nonetheless, I did my best. Dr. Dennis Stanton. Signing off, I whispered into my comms. The only answer was static. My gloved hands shook. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine I was somewhere else. Perhaps a meadow on Earth or the deck of a small fishing boat, the wind in my hair. Instead, I felt my breath becoming shallow, each inhalation an effort against a thinning supply of oxygen. The final minutes were a mixture of dread and inexplicable serenity. At 6% oxygen, I thought of removing my helmet. Part of me wanted to cling to life as long as I could, but another part, that rational scientist part, whispered that the end was inevitable. If I removed my helmet, it would be instant. The vacuum would freeze and suffocate me in seconds. Perhaps that was merciful, compared to slowly asphyxiating. At 4% oxygen, the planet below looked more radiant than ever. A swirl of clouds over the Atlantic, a faint reflection of sunlight on the seas. Life thrived there. Maybe not the same life I once knew, not the same culture, but it was still the cradle of humanity. I felt a strange sense of pride that we, as a species, had come this far. We had reached the moon, built a device like the hopper, even if it ultimately led me to this moment. 3% oxygen. My breaths were shallow, labored. Small black spots danced at the edges of my vision. The earth seemed to recede, or perhaps my eyes were dimming. I mustered the last of my strength, unclasping the latches that secured my helmet. The hiss of depressurization was faint under the pounding in my ears. My final thought was an image of the monstrous creatures from 2013-30, hungrily swarming. At least they hadn't gotten me. At least my end would be a quiet one, a cosmic silence instead of fangs and claws. Then I twisted the helmet free. For an instant, I felt a rush of air, cold like 1,000 needles across my face. My lungs burned, and a flash of darkness closed in. No pain, just an overwhelming blackness that swallowed everything. My last sight, a blur of blue and white, a planet so close, yet forever, out of reach. I died there, in the vacuum of space, a ghost of a lost timeline, bearing knowledge of a future no one would believe. My story, as I recount it in these final moments, is all that remains of me, Doctor. Dennis Stanton, an astronaut, a time traveller, and a casualty of the cosmic distances that separate hope from despair.